Alright, so we have the results in for the state elections in Bavaria and Hessen, and it was quite interesting. And I wanted to give a kind of overview, a quick dive into what happened in both of those states. So let's start off with Bavaria. Now, Bavaria is a state of around 12 million people. Its current government maintained its majority. The current government of the CSU, the Christian Social Union, that is the sister party of the CDU in the state of Bavaria, along with the Free Voters, won enough seats to hold their majority. The incumbent governor, Makazoda, from the CSU, will be reelected. Now, we see an interesting result here. We have pretty much a three-way race that happened between the Free Voters, the AfD, and the Greens. I talked about in one of my previous videos. What was expected to happen sort of panned out. The Free Voters did come second place, as was expected. However, the AfD did manage to beat the Greens. So the Greens fell from second to fourth place. The AfD beat them just by 0.2%, so they are actually tied in seats, even though the AfD is slightly ahead. The Free Voters saw a large increase in their vote share, going up 4.2, winning almost 16% of the vote, and the AfD also at the same time saw substantial gains, gained more than any other party. The reason the AfD in Bavaria didn't gain more than they could have is because they were competing with the Free Voters. The Free Voters and the AfD do have a similar kind of right-wing populist message, and so they were competing with each other for votes. That is why the CSU did not gain that much, even though the CDU is polling very high on the federal level. And we also saw the left-wing parties or the government parties of the Greens, the SPD, and the FDP all losing support here in Bavaria. Now, the result for the CSU, the 32%, this is an okay result. Of course, they won the election. They are by far the largest party. However, for historical standards, this is very low. The CSU, for much of its history, ruled Bavaria on its own. They were able to win 50-60% of the vote and hold an absolute majority in the state legislature. So this election for them is okay, but it is, for historical standards, not that great. The Free Voters, this is an amazing result. This is what they are expected. There was a scandal involving their leader, Hubert Aiwanger, that appeared to have actually helped him, and we see that clearly with him gaining almost 50% more than the previous election, on top of the fact that he was competing with the AfD for votes. Now, the Greens suffered some losses. They, in 2018, won their best ever result in the state, coming second place, and they dropped 3.2 points to 14.4. Now, I think there's a mix of two things. One, they don't have the momentum behind them that they had in 2018. The focus of this campaign was more on migration and the economy and less of the climate and environmental issues that had helped the Greens to win the result that they got. And also, there's a lot of anger at the current federal government that drove support away from not only the Greens, but you see the SPD and the FDP. Now, it's interesting to note the SPD suffered in Bavaria their worst result in a West German state ever. So that means in any of the state elections throughout Western Germany and, of course, Germany altogether. Well, no, just West Germany from 1949. This is their worst ever result. They've suffered worse results in Eastern Germany, but in the Western states, they have not dropped this low before. And the last election, where they dropped from 20 to about 9.5%, was already a historic low. That was already a huge defeat for them. The fact that they are falling even more is a bad sign for the party. The FDP lost representation in the state. They had barely gotten over with about 5.1% in the last state election. They had representation in the Bavarian Landtag, and after this result, they are clearly not going to make it. They only got 3%, 2 points below what they needed. They have lost all representation. Die Linke was not involved in the Landtag. They had no representation. They've never been able to win representation in Bavaria on the state level, and they dropped even more. So that's kind of an overview of the results in Bavaria. If we look at the seat count, Makazoda and his CSU will by far be the largest party with 85 seats. The Free Voters and the AfD, of course, both gained, and the Free Voters second with 37 seats. The AfD and the Greens are tied with 32. So who will be opposition leader is still somewhat uncertain, but I will do another video talking about that as we get closer. But we can clearly see here that the three parties of the government, the Traffic Light Coalition, the Greens, the SPD, and the FDP, all together lost around 6.5 points. So that is a clear signal that the German public is angry at the current federal government, and this election was used as somewhat of a test for it. Now I want to go to the results in Hessen that were slightly different. Now we see the CSU, or sorry, the CDU won this election outright. Not only did they win this election, they were able to gain significantly. The polls had put them at around 31, 32%, but they managed to get 34.6 with their lead candidate Boris Rhein. He was the incumbent governor, and he is going to maintain that position. The current government is a black-green coalition of the CDU and the Greens, and although the Greens lost some, the CDU gained enough that this coalition by far has a majority, and there's no signs of anything switching. So Boris Rhein will become the governor again under a coalition with the Greens. Now, what's interesting to note here is the AfD was able to win significantly, going from 13.1% in 2018 to 18.4%. This is an increase of 5.3. This was much higher than the polls had anticipated. There were some outlier polls that put the AfD up at 19%, but most of the polling had them at around 15.5 to 16, so they were able to outperform the polls by around 1.5, 2 points. And this is the first time that the AfD has come second place in a West German state. They've come second in the East German states, but in West Germany, this is the first time. So this is an important milestone for the party, on top of also gaining significantly off of the 2018 results. Now, the SPD, this result for the SPD is a disaster. Not only because this is the worst result ever that the party has got in this state, but that is on top of, in 2018, also getting their worst result ever. So they've gotten their worst result 2 times in a row, and this was despite the fact that their lead candidate, Nancy Faeser, was in the race. She was leading the party to become governor of the state, and she was someone that maybe necessarily wasn't that popular, but someone that had the name recognition, someone that was involved in the state politics, someone that's in the federal cabinet, someone who is known, someone who is an important figure. And even with her, the SPD barely managed to get 15%. And not only was this a horrendous result for the party, this is even lower than what the polls had expected. The polls had expected early on Faeser to be at about 24%. That was around the same time of the federal election. Over the summer, when they started to get a lot of polls for this election, the SPD was polling at around 20%, and they dipped to around 17, 18%. And the last 2 weeks before the election, they were polling at around 16. The lowest poll put the SPD at 15.5, and you see the SPD even underperformed the lowest poll. And what's interesting to note is despite the fact that the SPD, a center-left party, suffered heavy losses, the Greens did not benefit from this at all. Not only did they suffer losses as well, they suffered more than was expected as well, and they went from second place to fourth place. So this means the Greens in both Bavaria and Hessen, which they had won second place in 2018, dropped from their second place to fourth place with heavy losses. And this is, like I said, because of the momentum that they've lost since 2018, but also the anger towards the current federal government. And you can see a lot more clearly here. In Bavaria, there was a 6.5% swing against the governing parties. In Hessen, it was about a 12.5% swing. Now, the FDP also suffered significant losses. They, by the skin of their teeth, managed to make it into the federal parliament. They got 5.03%. So they were able to get enough votes to make it into the state legislature, but they did suffer losses. And if they're at 5% here, that means in a lot of states they're going to struggle to get into the legislature. They have lost representation in Bavaria and a number of other states, so it definitely is a hard time for the party. We saw the Free Voters, who, like I said, are mainly strong in Bavaria. They made some small gains, but nothing here to be significant. They're not going to enter the state legislature. Bavaria is really the only place that they're able to be successful in. Now, Die Linke, this was in Hessen, one of the few West German states that's not a city state that the left party had representation in. They had it, I believe, since 2008 or 2009. And the left party is going through a lot of problems, a lot of kind of identity crisis, and a lot of infighting. They have lost representation completely in the state. Their result was halved, and they failed to get the 5%, and they're losing their representation in the Hessen state legislature. As you can see with these results, this is a huge swing to the right in Hessen, which was for a long time a swing state. Hessen has been ruled by the CDU for the past 25 years. However, on the federal level, they still vote heavily for the SPD, and even if the CDU has run the state, the overall legislature has been somewhat mixed or somewhat left-wing at times. Just the CDU has been the largest party for a long time. But we see not only has the CSU won this election with larger gains than expected, but also the AfD. So the two right-wing parties overperformed the polls, gaining even more than they were expected to gain, and the two left-wing parties did the exact opposite, with also the FDP and the left losing support. This election, I think one of the biggest takeaways is the result for Nancy Faeser. This has arguably destroyed her political career. There was cause for her to resign from the opposition, from her own side. This has weakened her as a figure because she went there as someone who was in the cabinet, someone who was from Hessen state politics with a bid to become governor. And not only did she not improve, and not only did she just fall short, she came third place. She was beat by the CDU, by the AfD, and lost a record amount of support, giving the party the worst result in the state's history. And even she talked about resigning as the head of the Hessen SPD. So what will happen in the future is not yet certain. But overall, these results were definitely a bad result for the governing parties, a signal that the German public is angry at the current traffic light coalition. And so that is pretty much what happened. I will do some more videos doing a deeper dive into what actually happened in the states, looking at the map, looking at the movement of the voters from the different parties. But as of now, I wanted to do just a quick overview of the election with the results that we have. And that will be it for this video. I hope you all enjoyed. Please like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.